Tonight, we are pleased to present Michael Salla on the subject of U.S. presidents and exopolitics. Have you ever wondered how much our U.S. presidents are told about the existence of extraterrestrial life and technologies by their advisors, agencies, and appointed committees with a need to know access to these highly classified topics? How much are U.S. presidents briefed about the research and development of secret space programs by the different branches of the U.S. military and the intelligence community? Tonight, Dr. Michael Salla will provide an overview of how U.S. presidents have increasingly been out of the loop of exopolitical developments and easily manipulated when given limited briefings on topics related to extraterrestrial life and technology and associated reverse engineering programs. Michael E. Salla, PhD, is the author of 9 books dealing with exopolitics and secret space programs, many of which have been Amazon bestsellers. He has held full-time academic appointments at American University and George Washington University. He has appeared in hundreds of interviews, including Coast to Coast AM and Ancient Aliens, and his website is exopolitics.org. Without further ado, I'm pleased to present Dr. Michael Salla.
Thank you for that introduction, Eric. I'm very pleased to be back to MUFON Orange County. I think it has been a good 12 years or so since I was there last, and I very much enjoyed my visit at that time. But a lot has happened since then. I am now in Hawaii. I think at the time I was probably still living in the Washington, D.C. area. But I've made the move over to Hawaii, and life over here, as you can imagine, is pretty good. So I do have a PowerPoint presentation, so I do have a lot of material to cover, so I will get into that right away. So let me start this share screen feature, and I am now, hopefully you are now seeing my screen, and I am going to start my presentation. Always getting the minutia of these PowerPoint presentations, integrating it with Zoom is always a little challenging, but hopefully now you can see my first slide, which is of a US presidents and exopolitics, the title of my talk today. So I was very intrigued when I went to see the notice on Orange County MUFON for today's webinar that you have guys surfing with a UFO in the background. Well, I thought that was very appropriate because what I do here in my spare time in Hawaii is I love to surf, and my favorite surf spot is Kahalu'u here on the Big Island. And so there's a shot of me on catching a wave just last month. So definitely, I think people in MUFON, Orange County, and we have a lot in common: UFOs and surfing. That's pretty good. So what I'm going to be talking about is presidents and UFOs. So it's always good to do a little bit of a literature review, like who has talked about this topic before. And I want to begin by saying that I first learned or first got a lot of information on this topic by visiting a website that was up for well over a decade, from 2002 all the way up to 2018, for 16 years. If you wanted to know anything about US presidents and UFOs, you would go to Grant Cameron's site, presidentialufo.com. And it covered presidencies from Roosevelt onto Obama, who all had very interesting stories about UFOs and extraterrestrial life. Now, I knew Grant very well. I knew Steve Bassett very well, who worked with Grant. And Grant and Steve were working actually on a book on UFOs and presidents. And I was very interested in that because I also wanted to write about a book about presidents and exopolitics, US presidents, and wanted to really write about that. But I felt kind of honor bound to acknowledge the tremendous work that Grant Cameron had put into the website. So I didn't want to kind of like steal his thunder or anything like that. So I just kind of let the matter drop when I learned from Steve Bassett that he and Grant were working on a book, UFO, Presidents and UFOs. So I was very surprised that the book never came out, that actually another book was written by Larry Holcomb called The Presidents and UFOs. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. So that is a book that really goes very deeply into the same material that Grant Cameron covered in his website and gives a lot of details into what was going on. Now, one of the things I really appreciated in reading the book by Larry Holcomb was that he did use a lot of leaked documents, a lot of, and as well as FOIA documents. And the leaked documents in particular, the ones from the Majestic Documents website that Dr. Robert Wood has been working on for well over a decade. And I know you know Bob really well. And that I thought it was really good that Larry Holcomb introduced that material, because I think it really is very important to get to the big picture of like what is going on with presidents. If you just rely on FOIA documents or any official documentation out there or public statements, media reports, you're going to come away with just a very little understanding, a very superficial understanding of what's been happening behind the scenes with presidents. But it's thanks to the Majestic Documents website that we actually have a lot more information about what different presidents have been doing when it comes to the UFO topic. And so I was very glad that Larry Holcomb introduced that into his book. So overall, I think his book is an excellent introduction to US presidents and UFO history. He gives a lot of examples of UFO cases that occurred during different presidencies. So I thought all that was very, very helpful, especially for beginners. But I did have some criticisms. One of the criticisms I had was that I thought that there were a lot of UFO cases covered where there wasn't any direct connection to the president in power at the time. So it was almost like a tangential, you had to like make that inference that there was a connection, and I thought that could have been improved, or much more kind of discussion about what the presidents were doing regarding UFOs at that period. But I think it was, basically because often there's not that much material about the presidents themselves, but about UFO cases that occurred during that period. I thought that one of the other things that I would have done very, very different to what Larry did was that he was missing what I considered to be a comprehensive exopolitical analysis, especially when it comes to disputed historical events that are very pertinent to presidents and the UFO connection. So I thought that was something that was missing, and I will go into what I think was missing from the book, and why I think you, the audience, really ought to take note of this, and why it is important that we understand these disputed historical events and how they pertain to presidents. So the question many of you might have is, well, what is exopolitics? What's that all about? Well, there's a definition that was provided by the Exopolitics Institute. And the definition says that exopolitics is an interdisciplinary scientific field with its roots in the political sciences. So it's a political science. We're not talking physical science or the natural sciences. So very different methodologies. And it continues, that focuses on research, education, public policy with regard to the actors, institutions, and processes associated with extraterrestrial life, as well as the wide range of implications that this entails through public advocacy and newly emerging paradigms. So I think it's very important to point out that exopolitics is a social science. It's not one of the natural sciences, which means that we in the social sciences pay a lot more attention to what people are saying, what groups are saying and doing, what communities are saying and doing, as opposed to the natural sciences, which focus much more on empirical events that you can measure, analyze, and evaluate. You can't always measure and evaluate what's going on in a person's head. For example, if a person says, well, you know, I got picked up by a UFO and I was taken up there and then they brought me back and I forgot everything. And then after a week, my memory came back. I remember everything that happened on the ship. Well, without any objective empirical data, how do you evaluate that case? But in the social sciences, you know, there are ways of evaluating that person's testimony. But in the natural sciences, that would be dismissed as just anecdotal. It's not really relevant to that kind of process. So importantly, exopolitics is a political science, and we look at things like human intelligence. What is it that people are seeing, experiencing, and believing when it comes to this phenomenon? Now, exopolitics, to my mind, is very much like a chessboard, a 3D chessboard, if you like. You have in the middle of this picture here, you have what is considered to be conventional global politics. So you have in there a lot of maps, or a lot of flags, sorry, a lot of flags of different nations. So obviously we understand that a lot of international politics deals with the relationships between nation states. And then you throw in that other graph, which shows these kind of non-state actors like corporations, NGOs like Amnesty International. So that's another element of international politics or global politics as it's known. But when it comes to exopolitics, we're bringing in other dimensions, other elements. We're bringing in, obviously, the UFO element. What are they? Who's piloting them? And according to a lot of witness testimony, we know that the pilots tend to be either extraterrestrial entities, beings from other worlds, or beings that are indigenous to our world but live either at the bottom of the oceans or live underground in these huge cavern systems under the Earth's surface. So the Earth's crust is a couple of 100 miles thick, so you can imagine within that couple of 100 miles you can have huge pockets, and these are often described as like caverns, sometimes the size of a state like Texas. So that's how big they are under the Earth's surface. And so according to witnesses, contactees, and others that have first-hand information, they say that there are advanced civilizations that live. So all of this is something that anyone doing exopolitics needs to take into account. So my background, as Eric explained, I have an academic background. I was teaching in the School of International Service from 1996 to 2001. Before that, I was at the Australian National University with a full-time academic position. So in 2001, I went through a life-changing experience where I watched the Disclosure Project press conference organized by Dr. Stephen Greer, and that really got me going on this whole phenomenon. And so by early 2004, I wrote a book, and it's actually the first published book on exopolitics. And in that book, it discusses the extraterrestrial phenomenon in relationship to public policy, international conflict, that was my specialty, and disputed historical events such as, and this is where my book, Exopolitics, is very different to, say, books like Larry Holcomb's UFOs and the Presidents, because this is where I begin to look at some of these disputed historical events and how they pertain to presidents. So, for example, the data, the information that the 2003 Iraq war that the US entered into under President Bush actually had a lot to do with these advanced technologies or stargates in Iraq. So I discuss that in the book. Also, I discuss a German presence in Antarctica, that Nazi Germany had established a redoubt in Antarctica. and that this was something that presidents have had to deal with over the succeeding decades. And also US extraterrestrial agreements. These are three historical events directly relevant to US presidents that Larry Holcomb didn't cover in his book. So that's one area that I would be very critical of his book, that I think that these historical events are very important to cover. And one of my books in my Secret Space Program book series is looking at the role of the German secret base in Antarctica and subsequent overflights of the United States by the Germans who had established a base there in Antarctica, and where they had developed very advanced technologies and used that as a base to fly over different parts of the Earth, including South America and North America. Also, secret diplomatic negotiations with extraterrestrial visitors. I discussed that in the book. Agreements with that German Antarctic colony and extraterrestrial allies. There were agreements that people have told us, or witnesses, credible people have come forward and told us, that the Germans were able to get to Antarctica because they had reached agreements with an extraterrestrial sponsor, if you like. And I'll talk about all of this more in my presentation. I'm just giving you kind of like a thumbnail introduction into some of these key historical events, these three historical events that are all disputed. And I accept that hard evidence is elusive in these cases. But this is the question we all have. Do we ignore these individuals and documents, leaked documents and otherwise, that point to these kinds of disputed events being very real, or do we include it in our history and understanding of US presidents and UFOs? So this is one of the key questions, and it's a big debate. Larry Holcomb chose to ignore it in his book. If I had the opportunity to write UFOs and the presidents, I would have included these historical events, and I have included them in my Secret Space Program book series and other books on exopolitics. So the big question that a lot of people have is, well, is it true that the Germans really get to Antarctica and establish a base? And people often say, well, where's the hard evidence? There's no hard evidence for this. Well, actually there is hard evidence. In July 7, 1939, before the Second World War had broken out, President Roosevelt had given orders to Admiral Richard Byrd to go to Antarctica to find Nazi bases. And so there's a newspaper clipping from that time, and it was basically giving Byrd his marching orders that he was to outfit several ships and to go to Antarctica and look for the German bases that had been established there earlier and find out whether or not they were located in the West Antarctic region. And if they were, that would have been a violation of the Monroe Doctrine, and that would have led to a dispute with Germany. So that was what Byrd did. And so a mission actually did go there. And the mission was actually sponsored by, and it's called Byrd's Third Antarctic Expedition. And it was sponsored by the US Navy, the State Department, the Department of the Interior, and the Treasury. So those are all major players in the US political system. So why would they have been so keen to fund Admiral Byrd to go down to Antarctica in 1939? I mean, they had good intelligence, which has not been released, that the Germans had established bases in Antarctica. They didn't know where they were, and so Byrd's job was to go down there and find them. So that is important historical evidence saying that, yes, the US, at the very least, suspected that in 1939 the Germans had built bases in Antarctica, or had good intelligence that the Germans were developing bases down there and expanding them. And this is precisely what this gentleman, William Tompkins, says had happened. Now, I believe you all know William Tompkins very well. Bob Wood has talked about him in the past, so you know about his background. Precocious 17-year-old, trained to write aeronautical briefing reports based on packets, or based on debriefings on Navy spies that were based in Nazi Germany. And when those spies came to the United States, they shared information with Bill about the German bases in Antarctica, and told Bill that the Germans were building these bases out, and that these were where a lot of advanced prototypes of flying saucers were being developed. So the Germans were developing flying saucer prototypes not only in Nazi Germany, but also in Antarctica. Very important. Now, one of the things that Bill said, which is very controversial, but nevertheless, I mean, this was an important element in his debriefings of these spies, was that he was saying that the Germans had been helped by a group of reptilian extraterrestrials in building their bases in Antarctica, and that the Germans had been helped by these extraterrestrials to develop sufficient flying saucers to become self-sustaining in Antarctica in the face of a prospective attack by the US. So that's another part of Bill's testimony that is really very important. And I bring Bill Tompkins up in this regard because his background is quite solid. And the thing is, he is probably the only man alive, or that has ever come forward to talk about this Navy espionage program based out of Naval Air Station San Diego, where there were these debriefings on Navy spies embedded in Nazi Germany, coming back and reporting on Germany's advanced aeronautical projects. So Bill Tompkins was a first-hand witness to these events. He's provided ample documents. Many of these documents have been provided in his books, Selected by Extraterrestrials, volumes 1 and 2, where you see a lot of documents substantiating Bill's experiences at Naval Air Station San Diego, where he got to learn firsthand of what these Navy spies believed was happening in Antarctica based on what they had learned while they were there conducting espionage in Nazi Germany. And volume 3 is currently being prepared, and in volume 3, Bill goes into much more detail into Antarctica and the reptilian extraterrestrials, and how the Germans in Antarctica were being helped. So that's definitely something that is going to provide a lot more kind of detail about exactly what was happening down there. So now we go to the subject of presidents. What were the different presidents doing on this topic? Well, President Roosevelt and exopolitics. So what was Roosevelt's role in all of this? Now, here you have a picture of President Roosevelt with Prime Minister Churchill and the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. So that was taken sometime, I think 1944, just before the end of the Second World War, as they were planning, I think, the Yalta agreements, when they were planning how to divvy up occupied Germany, given that its impending defeat. So President Roosevelt, he was directly involved in the extraterrestrial issue, and this was because of something that happened on February 24, 25, right there in Los Angeles, the Battle of Los Angeles. And I'm sure you're all very familiar with what happened on that evening. So I just want to go into a statement that Bill Tompkins made in Selected by Extraterrestrials, because Bill Tompkins was actually a witness of the Los Angeles air raid. He actually saw the flying saucers that were flying over. And I think it would be good for me to just read his firsthand witness testimony of what happened that evening. So this is what he said. Just after midnight, the air raid sirens and anti-aircraft guns of the coastal artillery woke everyone up. We ran out onto the street and saw a large round craft above 7,000 feet up, floating in the air above us. It slowed to a stop right overhead and remained stationary. It was lit up by 8 searchlights, while anti-aircraft shells burst all around and against it. Most of the shells exploded on the bottom of the craft. We just couldn't believe the thing hadn't exploded or been shot down. 3, then 5 other ships appeared near it. Some of the searchlights, as well as the anti-aircraft teams, focused on each one as they passed the first object. Eventually, the first craft slowly departed as well. So that was Bill Tompkins writing about it in volume 1 of Selected by Extraterrestrials. So he was a first-hand witness and saw that, and that happened around the same time as he was actually being trained to conduct debriefings of the Navy spies at San Diego, and to then prepare briefing packets that would be disseminated throughout the US aeronautical community at the time. Now, as far as the official reaction to the Los Angeles air raid was concerned, there were varying reactions. The reaction by the Army Secretary, Henry Stimson, was that it was a real alarm, but nothing to be worried about, that it was all under control. And so people at that time were much more focused on the Pacific War. Of course, Japan had launched Pearl Harbor only 3 months or 2 months earlier. And so people were focused on the war, were worrying whether or not this was a Japanese attack. When the Army Secretary said that there was something did happen, but didn't go into any detail, people just went back to the business of focusing on the war effort. What we do know about the Battle of Los Angeles and its connection to UFOs and President Roosevelt's direct involvement doesn't come from public statements. It comes from these leaked documents. And the most important are a set of memoranda that can be found on the Majestic Documents website. And these are memoranda from President Roosevelt or to President Roosevelt. So in this February 27 memorandum from President Roosevelt, he talked about the recovery of celestial devices relevant for World War II weapons development. And so that happened 2 days after the Los Angeles air raid. And in his book, The Presidents and UFOs, Larry Holcomb makes a very important point that the celestial devices that Roosevelt was referring to here in this document was not what was recovered from the Los Angeles air raid, because he didn't at that time know what had been recovered. Actually, he was referring to an earlier incident that happened in 1941, most likely the Cape Girardeau UFO crash incident that has been covered extensively by others. I recommend Ryan Wood's book, which covers 74 UFO crashes and crash retrieval operations, and he begins, I think the first one is the Cape Girardeau UFO crash. Now, one of the key elements to take away from this document is an exopolitical statement, which is that the debris that's recovered is not to be shared with the Soviet Union. And the implication is that it's okay to share it with Britain, but not with the Soviet Union. It also pointed out that Dr. Vannevar Bush, President Roosevelt's chief science advisor, would be leading a scientific study. And also Roosevelt put the Army in control of the whole area of studying the celestial, or studying retrieved flying saucers. So right away, we understand that President Roosevelt was directly involved in setting up the infrastructure and the key institutional mechanisms for dealing with retrieved flying saucers. There was another memorandum approximately a week later, and this is actually another majestic document, and it actually details that there were 2 UFOs that were recovered after the LA raid incident, one by the Army and one by the Navy. So these are not the celestial devices that Roosevelt talked about in this February 27 memorandum, because at that time he didn't know, he hadn't been told what had been recovered from the Los Angeles air raid. But he's here, or perhaps he was given just some vague idea that something had been recovered, but no details yet. But on March 5, the details were provided, and that the craft were recovered by the Army, one by the Navy as well, and that one or both of the craft were then taken to Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio, for further study by the Army Air Force, because that was, at the time, that was the premier aeronautical facility in the United States there at Wright Field for the Army Air Force. And also another important element that can be gleaned from this document is that the March 5 memo is also the origin of the Army's Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit. So there's a passage there which says, quote, "As a consequence, I've issued orders to Army G2 that a special intelligence unit be created to further investigate the phenomenon and report any significant connections between recent and those collected by the director of the Office of Coordinator of Information." So this, Dr. Wood and Ryan Wood, on the Majestic Documents website, they say that this is probably the order that created the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit, and I agree with that. I think this is precisely what that was, and it's very important to appreciate that this was done as a consequence of what the Army was doing after being given control over the flying saucer issue by President Roosevelt. So there's a FOIA document that was released that proves that the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit was real, despite US Air Force initial denials. I'm sure others have covered this. People like Dr. or Major Kevin Randall have talked about this document at length. And so there's no disputing now that the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit did exist. There's dispute over when it was created. According to those in the Air Force trying to account for the creation of this unit, they said it was never operational, and it was created as a kind of like in the early 1950s as some kind of exploratory brainstorming outfit. But in fact, it had been created by President Roosevelt, as we know from those leaked documents. Now, another document that directly gives us an insight into President Roosevelt was his mind concerning the development of flying saucer technology, was that on February 1944, so this would have been just before the Yalta Agreement between Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, Roosevelt decided that the study of recovered flying saucers will proceed after World War II. So essentially, they were going to sit on the recovered technologies, the celestial devices, as Roosevelt talked about them in his earlier memorandum on February 28, 1941, that they were going to sit on those until after the war. And in the meantime, the emphasis would remain on conventional weapons to win the war. And the conventional weapons, we all know, tanks, airplanes, aircraft carriers, but especially the atomic bomb. Now, President Roosevelt didn't make it to the end of the war. He got pretty close, but then after winning the after winning the 44 elections, and before, well, actually, I think he may have begun his fourth term in office, but then he died, and he was replaced by President Truman, who was his vice president at the time. And so Truman now had all of this information thrust upon him, and he apparently didn't know anything about the Manhattan Project. I'm sure he didn't know anything about UFOs, extraterrestrial life, German bases in Antarctica. These were all things that Roosevelt had been briefed upon. He knew about those things, and now Truman had to get up to speed on these topics. So now we get to Operation High Jump in 1946. Now, this is probably the most cited event in terms of those that want to prove or want to assert that the Germans did escape and made it to Antarctica and established bases there. That there had been some casualties suffered by Admiral Byrd's expedition in 1946-47, and there were planes lost, and Admiral Byrd did talk about casualties when he was coming back to the United States and giving an interview in Chile. Now, what we do know is that there have been a lot of reports that have come out talking about significant casualties that had been suffered by the US in the Antarctica by the German Antarctic space program that had been established there. So there's some historical film footage showing some PBM-5 mariners that had crashed and with survivors. So this is an official document. There have been a lot of reports and a lot of leaked documents that suggest that there had been a German base that had been established and that had directly engaged with the Admiral Byrd's expedition there, including William Tompkins and others. And this is a fairly important point because if the Germans did establish a base in Antarctica and did develop advanced flying saucer craft that had been weaponized as a result of agreements that they had reached with extraterrestrials, and President Roosevelt knew about this, President Truman had been briefed about this, and then authorized Operation High Jump to find the bases and to destroy the bases. But Operation High Jump suffered significant casualties. And there's no doubt that Admiral Byrd was muzzled. That Admiral Byrd was definitely very concerned about what had happened there, talking about a new enemy that could fly from pole to pole that was now a threat to the United States. So what exactly are we talking about then in terms of threatening the United States? Well, this is where we get into the US overflights of US territory by UFOs that really took off in June of 1947. Of course, you have the famous Kenneth Arnold incident where he saw 9 craft that had that shape, and that's his illustration of a kind of flying wing. And so at that time, the only aircraft that resembled a flying wing had been developed by Nazi Germany, and those were the Horten brothers developed a prototype that was the Horten 229, and that was developed and tested in Nazi Germany in 1944 and had been recovered by the US under Operation Lusty. Now, that was brought into the US under Operation Lusty in 1945, and obviously that was something that the people over at Wright Field were studying very, very closely to understand the feasibility of that kind of technology. And also they would have had the briefing packets that William Tompkins had provided. And Bill Tompkins also shares the view. He's one of the people that says that the Germans were doing overflights of US territory at that time. So this is where we get into this period where you actually have a lot of a lot of the V-2 rockets that were being tested in the United States for the future US missile program and the what would eventually would be the NASA space program, that these V-2 rockets were being tested, and there were a lot of disruptions of these tests. And beginning in 15th of May, you actually had the first testing, or the first example of one of these rockets being interfered with by a UFO. And so the question is, well, if UFOs were interfering with these rockets, who was behind those UFOs? You know, were they German? Were they extraterrestrial? I mean, that's a question. So I already covered, Kenneth Arnold saw the nine flying wings that resembled the Horton prototype flying wing. And so the question is, well, German or extraterrestrial? Is this what people were seeing beginning in 1947 and throughout the 1940s, the flying saucer sightings? What were they? What was the origin? One thing we do know is that there were significant losses that were suffered by the Army Air Force trying to engage with and shoot down these craft, German or extraterrestrial craft, or a combination of the two. Here's something from Timothy Good's book, Need to Know, where he talks about this. So from research conducted to date, over 60 US Army and Navy aircraft, I mean, that's a lot of aircraft, B-29s, B-17s, Corsairs, B-80s, AT-6s, and so on, were lost over this 2-month period from May 1950 to April 1951. 120 airmen were killed and 74 others injured in these incidents. So there were significant casualties being suffered by the US that was trying to engage with these flying saucers flying over US territory. Again, who was shooting down the Army Air Force jets that were trying to intercept the flying saucers? Were these Germans from Antarctica? Were these extraterrestrials, off-world extraterrestrials, or maybe inner Earth, what we might call intraterrestrials? Okay, one clue as to what was going on was there was a lot of interest by the flying saucers, or by the occupants, in nuclear weapons technologies. And of course, the Roswell Crash, 1947, many people have made this point before, is that at the time it was the world's sole nuclear strike force. It was the base for the 509th Bomber Group. And so that was used for launching the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so the flying saucers were very interested in those. So the Roswell incident itself, I think when we look at books such as this one by Thomas Carey and Don Schmidt, I think they make an excellent case with lots of witness testimony and documentation that this did involve an extraterrestrial spacecraft, and that there was an officially sanctioned cover-up by the government and the military, and that went all the way to the very top. And so President Truman was directly involved in that. Very important that Roosevelt was involved in the UFO issue from the very beginning, and we can see that Truman was also involved. 1947, the report of the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit about the Roswell crash, it gives us an idea of some of the advanced technologies that were recovered from the crash. And it also recommended that a detailed scientific study be conducted of this. And so a team of scientists that was headed by Dr. Theodore von Karman was actually put together and went in and gave a report on the debris that had been studied, that had been recovered from Roswell. And that's also covered in the Majestic documents that report by the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit. So that is very helpful to know. Now, President Truman in September 1947 sets up the Majestic 12 group, sets up this group to manage the flying saucer issue and UFOs more generally. So I know you're all very, very familiar with the Majestic 12 group and how President Truman's memo, September 24, 1947, is a leaked document that has very high credibility, and so a lot of researchers accept it as genuine. And so the MJ12 group was set up in September 1947. That group was covered in great detail. It was covered in the Eisenhower briefing document, and many UFO researchers have discussed it over the subsequent years. So 12 personalities, leading figures, whether from the military, whether from the national security system, or whether from the scientific community, kind of evenly dispersed, 4 from each. Now, what I want to draw your attention to is from the top, the third on the right there, which was Secretary Forrestal, the first Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal, and he's a key figure in this for reasons I will bring up pretty soon as once I begin to discuss President Kennedy and what he was doing. So now we go to Truman. What did Truman know? How much did President Truman know about all of this? So he was quoted as saying in 1950 at a press conference, he said, "I can assure you that flying saucers, given that they exist, are not constructed by any power on Earth." So it seemed that he was saying that these are extraterrestrial craft. These are not constructed by any state entity that we would know. So according to that, you would say, well, the flying saucers that the Air Force and the Navy were all concerned about, they were extraterrestrial in origin, according to that particular quote. But there are quite a number of insiders, UFOs, that say that that wasn't the case, and that in 1952 there was the Washington Flyover, that actually involved the overflight of the capital, Washington, D.C., by German alien reproduction vehicles, or German flying saucers. That William Tompkins, he believed that these were German in origin. Clark McClelland, he had a 30-plus year degree, 30-plus years in NASA and various NASA contractors, and he spoke to many German scientists that were there under Operation Paperclip, and he says that these were German craft. Corey Good, who says that he served on the Navy's secret space program, or Solar Warden, he says that these were German craft, and that on smart glass pads that he had access to, that they refer to them as German craft, not extraterrestrial. Vladimir Terzinsky, an electrical engineer, he actually he was a part of the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences, and he came out saying that these were also German craft that had come from Antarctica to do overflights of the United States. And finally, there's another witness, Cooper, who he used Cooper as a pseudonym. He never revealed his identity, but he had been interviewed by Linda Moulton Howe, by Ron Garner, and also by Richard Dolan. And he says that one of his jobs in the late 1950s was to monitor UFO activity and to determine whether it was German or extraterrestrial. That was his job. So based on all these testimonies, we can say that the Germans did have operational flying saucers, that they were doing overflights of South America and North America, that the intelligence community knew about this, and that they were very likely directly involved in the 1952 flyover.